Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. And thank you for being so disciplined. Welcome to tonight's public forum, Stem Cells and Cerebral Palsy, the Promise and the Progress. I'm Andrew Buchanan and lucky to be one of the board members of Cerebral Palsy Alliance. And before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge the Guringai people who are the traditional custodians of this land. And I'd also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Guringai nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present. It's fabulous to see you tonight. Thank you for coming. And to see so many with cerebral palsy, their families and their carers who are here tonight at our Allambie headquarters. Isn't it a fabulous centre? We're very lucky and very grateful to be able to host this forum in this world-class venue, specifically designed and built to support people with cerebral palsy. And I extend a heartfelt thanks to our President of Cerebral Palsy, Marrow Thornton, AM, for the organisation's generosity in making this venue available to us tonight. Marrow is always very generous in terms of her care and devotion to this organisation. May I also thank the Research Foundation of Cerebral Palsy Alliance for sponsoring this forum. Stem cell science is a very exciting research area in terms of cerebral palsy prevention and cure. Our Research Foundation is playing a leading role in directing cerebral palsy research priorities around the world, and its sponsorship of tonight's forum is another example of the vital collaboration with key research bodies that it so effectively generates. Of course, collaboration has been crucial in putting together this forum. It's only possible due to the joint efforts of New South Wales Stem Cell Network and Stem Cells Australia, which are jointly hosting tonight with Cerebral Palsy Alliance. We thank both organisations for their foresight in seeing the need to hold such a forum. I'd also like to welcome participants joining us tonight from not only across Australia, but from around the globe. It's a bit unusual, isn't it? We are live streaming online and look forward to receiving your questions via the webcasting player and via Twitter, using the hashtag Stem Cells and CP Forum. One word, Stem Cells and CP Forum. So please join the conversation, and I know at least two who have registered who are using this streaming. One is our incredibly capable Chief Executive Officer, Rob White, who is currently working in Hong Kong, and the other is our 3-day-old grandson in Dubbo Hospital, and he's very interested in hearing about stem cell research. I received an SMS from him a short time ago. And it's also important, while I'm talking about Dubbo, we have some folk from Dubbo here tonight who have dropped their travel itinerary, and I have your tickets. And if you don't use it, I will, to go back to Dubbo. So tonight, what we would like to do is to send questions through. The panel will endeavour to answer your questions during the forum, but if that's not possible due to time constraints, then we'll publish the most common question and answers on the Cerebral Palsy website. And this website is where you can also watch the video from this event. Now, some quick housekeeping, if you don't mind, before we get started. Feel free to help yourself to refreshments during the course of the evening, and the bathrooms are to the back left. So, why are we here? You and me. Well, the answer is simple. Because we're all interested in what the future may hold in terms of the capacity of stem cell science to treat, to prevent, or even cure cerebral palsy. Now, there is often much excitement in the media about where stem cell science is at and the promise that it may hold for people with CP and their families. But what's fact, what's fiction, and what's somewhere in between? That's why we are here, to demystify stem cell science and provide an update on what has been achieved to date and what may be achieved in the not-so-distant future. We have an expert panel here tonight to do exactly that. They're all very modest and won't agree with me. But they're experts in their respective fields, and they're here to update you and more importantly, to answer your questions after their presentation during the Q&A. So please hold questions, if you wouldn't mind, until that time. Would you please welcome our panellists, Associate Professor Iona Novak, who is Head of Research at Cerebral Palsy Alliance. Iona has been an integral driving force in driving international collaboration into CP research. She's also a recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Scholarship for her research into stem cells, and tonight she'll detail what is currently known about CP, its causes and therapies. Associate Professor Megan Munsie, who is a stem cell scientist who combines her extensive technical expertise with an interest and understanding of the complex ethical, social and regulatory issues associated with stem cells in research and in the clinic. And she is the head of Education, Ethics, Law and Community Awareness Unit at the new government-funded Stem Cells Australia Research Initiative, and is based at the University of Melbourne and Monash University. And tonight she'll provide an overview of stem cell science. Professor Euan Wallace, who is Director of the Ritchie Centre at the Monash Institute of Medical Research. He's investigating the basic pathways by which the fragile developing brain is likely to be damaged and when such damage is likely to occur. Professor Wallace has developed treatments that target those pathways and are studying the effects of the treatments on brain structure and newborn function. Professor Wallace is also Director of Obstetric Services for Southern Health, and tonight he'll discuss if stem cells are the answer to treating cerebral palsy. So we have Sydney, we have Victoria. Let's go north to Queensland. And Stephen Archer is dad to soon-to-be 8-year-old Zach, who has cerebral palsy. And in November 2010, their family travelled to North Carolina for stem cell treatment for Zach, who was then 5 years old. Was there any benefit, and would they do it again? Stephen has kindly travelled from Brisbane to share their story. So without any further delay, a big welcome from us. Let's get started. And may I introduce Associate Professor Iona Novak.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, and thank you very much for having me here. I hope we're going to get the slides up. I've been asked this evening to talk about cerebral palsy. I feel that there are many people in this room that could actually give a better story about cerebral palsy than me, but what I wanted to do was highlight some of the current thinking about cerebral palsy and highlight some possibilities for where we might be able to think about what sorts of things would need to be considered in research trials for cerebral palsy so that we make the wisest and the safest decisions when conducting this really important research. So what is cerebral palsy? We have the definition up there, and believe it or not, it took many experts many years to actually agree on this definition, and there's still some controversy over this condition. But key features of the condition is that it's a disorder of movement and posture, but it affects the activities that people want to do. So whether they can write their name, whether they can walk up and give their mother a hug. And these are important life aspirations that we have as people. And it's described as a non-progressive condition, although there's almost some arguments starting to happen in the literature about whether in fact the inflammatory process of cerebral palsy go on longer than we originally thought. Well, that's very interesting for something like stem cell. It's still yet to be proven, so we don't know. And it occurs in the fetal or infant brain, and that's an important feature when we think about cerebral palsy. When we think about repairing a brain injury, obviously it's got to scientifically be easier when it's closer to the timing of the injury, but is there possibility for those people living with the condition as well? So who's at risk of cerebral palsy? We might think about this as important information when we're starting to think about designing stem cell studies. Well, of course, those that are born premature have a risk, and the earlier they're born, the bigger the risk. Those who are very sick at birth with a condition called neonatal encephalopathy also have a risk for cerebral palsy. But also the biggest portion of cerebral palsy, apparently by statistic, 0.1% have a risk for cerebral palsy, but they actually make up the biggest group. And they're the group that mothers and fathers present to paediatricians and say there's something wrong with my child. And they're also the groups we need to think about when we're thinking of designing stem cell studies. So this condition and the second half of the diagnosis and the description of cerebral palsy says that it affects people in a number of other ways, not just a physical condition. And this is work from a meta-analysis we did of all the registers around the world, and in fact we can say with a high degree of confidence 1 in 3 children with cerebral palsy cannot walk, 1 in 4 cannot talk, 1 in 4 have epilepsy, 1 in 5 have a sleep disorder. And we all know a good night's sleep is a very important thing, and when one person has a sleep disorder, lots of other people in the family also have disturbed sleep. And 3 in 4 are in pain, and I want to stay with that for a moment. Those of us who are able-bodied, when we have a headache, a simple headache, can actually get a Panadol and do something about it. But if you have a physical disability, you might not even be able to communicate you're in pain. And this is one of the most under-recognised with this, problems with this condition that we'd like to do something about. So right now I've got some videos on screen, and we talk about cerebral palsy having 5 levels of severity. The mildest form, where the person can walk independently and can conduct most of the sorts of tasks they want to do in their life. But number 2, where their movement and their speed and the quality of the walking is affected, but they can still walk. They might need to do something like hold a handrail. And you can see that those 2 groups together make up the biggest portion of cerebral palsy. Most of the public, when they think about cerebral palsy, are maybe thinking about people that need to use a wheelchair, that can't hold their head up. They might have an intellectual disability. But in fact, that's a smaller proportion of cerebral palsy, and that's good news. What about movement potential? Of course, there's a great deal of pressure on families when they have a child with cerebral palsy to say, am I doing everything I possibly can for my child with cerebral palsy? And one of the things that we have to be realistic about is that we do know quite a lot now about this condition and the upper potential of people with cerebral palsy. So those 5 levels of severity of cerebral palsy I told you down the side there, we know that over time, in the first 5 years of your life, you reach 90% of your movement potential. And after that, it starts to taper out if you're milder, and in fact in adolescence and adulthood, you can actually get physical decline. And that's what we call as scientists the natural history of cerebral palsy. That's the story that people on average will face. And of course, that's the impetus for why we want to look at an important treatment like stem cell, because this is not a condition that any of us want to face as our long-term future. So what are the treatments available currently, and why would we want to look at stem cell? Well, first of all, in this point where the motor curves are at their steepest point, so where you've got the most potential for improvement, that's where we're using now, and we have good evidence to suggest that's where we should be doing training, where we practice the task we want to learn repetitively, whether that's walking or writing or talking, because that's when your brain has the most plasticity opportunity, and that's where those evidence-based interventions should go. And then when we move to this phase where the curves start to flatten out or decline, obviously we have to come to some acceptance that you have reached your upper motor ability, and we need to find ways to help you be included in your life. So that will mean things like, for some people, wheelchairs, for some people, speech communication devices. And then, of course, right through the lifespan, because we know about this natural history of cerebral palsy, we also need to do a number of preventative interventions to make sure that if we can possibly stop the curves declining down and actually keep them on a straight line, we can do that for you. And that's why here in New South Wales we've been using a model that has been used extensively in Sweden and Norway to prevent some of the secondary impairments of cerebral palsy, like hip dislocation. So happily for cerebral palsy, this graph shows us that the amount of publications about the condition and what works is exponentially increasing. This is an important graph for a number of reasons. Firstly, it means new and more treatments are becoming online, and that means we must investigate stem cells as an option. Just because it hasn't been an option in the past doesn't mean we should accept in Australia that it shouldn't be an option for research now. We must research this possible treatment option. It also means that it's really hard for parents, people with cerebral palsy and professionals to stay up to date. Everything we knew 10 years ago has almost changed in this condition. This is a good news story, but it means we need to stay and work together to actively stay up to date and offer people the best possible opportunities. So what do those treatments look like? To help you through the maze, we've tried using this concept called bubble charts. So the size of the circle relates to the volume of research available, and the green means it's been proven to work in good quality research, red means it's been proven not to work, and yellow means we're not yet sure, and that could be for a range of reasons. It could be because it's not been researched enough, it could be because there's no research and yet there are claims on the internet, perhaps it works. Or it could be because there's conflicting research. One research camp says it works, another camp says it doesn't. So we can see if you wanted to manage spasticity, we've got a few good treatment options these days. Botox or botulinum toxin for a particular subgroup of cerebral palsy, selective dorsal rhizotomy, and also other drugs. What about if you wanted to manage your contractures? Well, in fact, the best one is actually plaster casting, as difficult as that is. So we need to work closely with families to check it's working for you. What about improving your muscle strength? We now know a lot about how to improve muscle strength using things like gymnasium weight training, and this has been an important breakthrough in the last 5 to 10 years, because before that we thought increasing muscle strength actually made your muscle spasticity worse. But we now know that's not true. In fact, people benefit a great deal from having more muscle strength. What about if we wanted to improve your motor skills? Well, in the last 5 years, there's been a plethora of new options come available because of extensive research, a lot of which has been conducted in Australia, and there's a very active network here. So constraint-induced movement therapy for people with hemiplegia, where we constrain the dominant hand to help you learn to practice using the non-dominant hand extensively. Goal-directed training, where we ask you what it is you'd like to learn to do, and then we work out the tasks you can't do and help you practice in a massed way that helps your brain change in response to that and that you learn that task. And there are a number of other ones listed there, and I'll keep going for time, but we do have a great deal of options now available. And then we have some of the same treatment options which also can help people with becoming more independent and being the sort of person and taking on the sort of roles they want to take on. But we do have to talk about this big elephant in the room. And the big elephant in the room is that whilst these are really important and we now have a number of effective treatments for people with cerebral palsy, on average, depending on the particular intervention, they give a 4 to 10% gain for people. And that's probably very important, small, meaningful gains, but probably not enough for most people, which is probably why most of you are in the room. So I like to look at this other data from a story in pain management, and I think it's a reasonable analogy, given 3 in 4 people with cerebral palsy have pain, is that if you ask people with chronic pain what made a treatment worth it, they say it needs to be really over at least 20% to 30% to have been worth it. We don't really have any treatments in rehabilitation or surgery in cerebral palsy yet that give that size of treatment gain. And so it's really important that we work together, and we want to work with you, people with cerebral palsy and parents and this group of researchers, to actually see whether we can find a treatment that does give a bigger gain than this. So as a result of this evening, we would love to stay in contact with you and invite you to be part of an ongoing dialogue about this issue in Australia and ensuring that we conduct safe and efficacious studies. Thank you very much.
Iona Novak, and I think it's amazing that we have a group of academics who are doing this research, and with great respect, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, they're so normal academics and can actually speak in a language that you and I can understand, because they're complex issues that we're actually dealing with. And I loved Iona's big elephant. It's nice that the colour of the elephant toned in with the wallpaper behind. Next is Megan Munsie, who, as you know, is a Victorian and will speak about the overview of stem cell science. Would you welcome Megan Munsie?
So, thank you very much, and it's an absolute delight to be here. And I am so impressed by this facility. It is just extraordinary. So, what I wanted to do today was to give you some facts about stem cells to really help our discussion in our Q&A. I think it's really important that we give you some information, but we hear what you want to know. So please think about those questions, and we want to hear all about them shortly. So I'm sure that you have seen the headlines. Here's a couple of my favourites. You probably saw some of the coverage last week around cloning and there's new type of stem cells you can get from cloned embryos. I feel like not a week goes by when there's not a story in the newspaper or on television. What concerns me is that these headlines and even the stories themselves are often quite misleading. It's not clear exactly where we are with stem cells, and I'm sure you read them and say, well, that's very interesting for someone who wants to grow new breasts, but what about for me? What does it mean for me or for my loved one? And that's what I'd really like to try to get to today. So let's go back to basics and let's talk about cells. So, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, sorry. I'm just going to grab my water. So I wanted to start with cells. So our body is made up of over 200 different types of cells. The cells have a couple of things in common. They start off with a nucleus and they have a cell body called a cytoplasm. And in this pretty image, you can see the green cytoplasm and the blue nucleus. The nucleus contains the DNA, which encodes for your genes. It's the nucleus that tells the cell what to do. So different cells of the body look and behave differently. So neurons, the cells of our nervous system, usually have long, thin bodies and they communicate messages over a long distance. Cells of the heart look and function completely differently. They are close together, locked side by side, and often you can't see the difference between one cell, where one cell finishes and the other one begins. And they function in harmony to keep the heart beating. So different cells have different functions. Different cells express different genes, okay? And it's really the genes that are driving all of this behaviour. So what's a stem cell? And a stem cell really is a very, very primitive cell. It's a very early cell that has a capacity to grow into one or more of those specialised cells. It also has the capacity to grow into a copy of itself. So the idea is that a stem cell can keep repopulating a tissue. And I suppose the best example of before I go on, I just want to say, and why scientists are so excited about stem cells is what we can do with them. Now, we hear a lot about regenerative medicine and the use of stem cells and cellular therapies, and that we can repopulate a diseased or damaged tissue with stem cells. And that's certainly what we're all interested in. That's the holy grail. But I just wanted to put a call out there for the stem cell as the kind of the basic tool of laboratory research, because we actually are using them in the lab all around the world to understand more about disease, to grow them in the lab, to grow and try different drugs on particular cells to see whether we can make a difference. And that's a very basic and useful use of stem cells. The fact that we can grow large numbers of cells, freeze them, store them, transport them easily, all bodes well for developing cellular therapy. So probably the most well-known and recognised stem cell is the blood stem cell, or the hematopoietic stem cell that resides in the marrow of our long bones. So you probably know somebody who's had a bone marrow transplant. The idea that someone with leukemia has a faulty stem cell that needs to be removed and replaced with a new healthy one, it's a concept we kind of get, and it's something we've been doing in the clinic for over 40 years. Can we use and extrapolate that use to other stem cell types? And that's kind of the question that we want to keep coming back to. And I want to raise, can we, as a little bit of a question, that it may be a little bit more complicated than what we can do in bone marrow. And I'll come back to that point later. I also want to mention that in the bone marrow, there's not just hematopoietic stem cells, there's also other stem cell types or stromal cells called mesenchymal stem cells or mesenchymal stromal cells, MSCs. These are cells that are also of great interest. They're like a companion cell to the blood stem cell. They have a capacity to dampen the immune system. In the laboratory, we know they can grow into fat and cartilage and bone. And they're of great interest to researchers as well. Cord blood. We're going to hear quite a bit about cord blood from Euan shortly, but I wanted to just to mention here that we've been using cord blood again in a clinical context since the 80s. So cord blood's isolated from the placenta. It can be processed and stored, and it has, as I said, been used since the 80s. There are lots of different types of cells in cord blood. It's not just hematopoietic stem cells, those mesenchymal stem cells are in there, and other cells of the immune system that might have a therapeutic application. But at the moment, the only proven treatment, and I love that bubble diagram of Iona's, but the sort of the green circle in stem cells for cord blood is diseases of the blood and immune system. Other applications, again, are orange. We don't quite know yet whether they're proven. So, the fact that stem cells can also be found in other organs of the body, and in fact almost all of the organs in the body, is really quite a new concept. Certainly when I was at uni, the idea that there are actually stem cells in the brain was just not accepted. But now we know that there are stem cells in organs that aren't naturally regenerative. So there are stem cells in the brain, there are stem cells in the heart, there are stem cells in the kidney. What we really don't know yet is how to recruit them, how to tease those guys out and make them work when we need them. And that's another big area of research, to try to understand how to kind of unlock and tease those cells into activity. Another type of stem cell that you probably have heard about is the embryonic stem cell. Now, these cells are derived from early human embryos. The photograph up the top there is a human blastocyst 7 days after fertilisation. It looks huge on the screen, but it's actually about the size of the tip of a pin, has about 100 cells. And what we do is isolate a particular type of cell you can see around the 6 o'clock mark, called the inner cell mass. We can culture those cells in the laboratory and turn them into stem cells. Now, these cells are a little bit different to tissue stem cells or cells derived from cord and bone marrow, in that they have this great capacity to grow into all of those cell types of the body that I talked about earlier. So they can grow into heart, they can grow into kidney, they can grow into lung. And we can grow quite large numbers of them. We can't necessarily grow them perfectly, but we certainly, since their discovery in the late 90s, we've learnt a hell of a lot. And we're just starting to harness the potential of these cells. The next type of cell I wanted to talk about was another new kind of kid on the block, the iPS cell, or induced pluripotent stem cell. I don't know if you remember last year, a Japanese researcher, Shinya Yamanaka, received the Nobel Prize. Okay, so that was for this discovery. Now, I think this is a fascinating story. He was able to change 4 genes in a skin cell and make it turn into a stem cell. And make it turn into a stem cell that has many of the same characteristics as an embryonic stem cell. So it's pluripotent. How and when these cells go into the clinic, there's still some questions about. But I think it's an incredible discovery. It was only announced in 2007, a very, very short time. And the Japanese government are putting a lot of effort into the clinical application of these cells. Of course, last week's announcement around cloning was really another way to make those embryonic stem cells on the left-hand side there. So another way to make a human embryo. So not through sperm-egg fusion, but through somatic cell nuclear transfer. So there's a taste of different types of stem cells. Now, what I think is really exciting is that we're now starting to see those different types of stem cells tested in clinical trials. So here's just a couple of examples of the many hundreds of clinical trials that are underway around the world. So you remember I said that there are proven treatments. They're really restricted to treating the disease of the blood and immune system, or skin grafts, and some causes of blindness. But that's it. That's it for proven treatments. These trials are exploring whether you can take, for example, in the case of mesoblast, cells from the bone marrow, these mesenchymal stem cells or precursor cells from that lineage, and grow those in the laboratory, freeze them down, and then treat people with diabetes, treat people with congestive cardiac failure, so heart disease, And they're just really starting to see whether these cells will be safe and effective. Another example is Advanced Cell Technology, which is an American company looking to treat macular degeneration. They are taking a particular type of cell that's made from human embryonic stem cells, and they put those cells under the retina. And they don't require a lot of cells, and they can slide them in under the retina, and they have seen, according to some of the first reports, some quite impressive recovery of vision. So these trials that are underway, some involve cord blood, some involve cells derived from embryonic stem cells, some involve mesenchymal stem cells, but they're all being tested in this kind of rigorous clinical trial where the first question to answer is it safe first? Contrast this kind of rigorous assessment with what you can learn from Dr. Google. Now, I'm a big fan of Dr. Google, as I'm sure we all are. I think it's an absolutely fantastic resource, but we need to use it with some consideration. And I just put this little warning sign up because I think it really is very powerful. But you need to do your research, but gather that information and take it back to your treating specialist who knows you and who can talk about whether the claims or what you read about online have some legitimacy. I think it's really tough when you type in stem cells into Dr. Google and CP or spinal cord injury, and you'll be sent to a long list of very impressive looking websites. And it's really tough to work out which of those clinics are doing clinical trials and which ones are just treating people. And I'd argue that stem cells have an enormous potential, but we really need to test that potential in clinical trials. And I'm concerned about some of these clinics offering almost like a kind of a silver bullet and saying the stem cells will just go in and fix it. And I think the time to be a bit wary is when a clinic is offering to treat people with a huge range of different conditions with the same approach. I think complex conditions require a rather complex and sophisticated solution. And so, think twice and perhaps go to your doctor who doesn't necessarily have a vested interest in selling you an expensive product. So I'll leave that there and look forward to the questions later.
I thought Megan's comment, or the headlines, was a very effective way of illustrating how the media portray this subject. I mean, if you and I are having difficulty in grasping this exciting initiative, then how do we expect media in all its forms to be able to portray what they do? And your other key phrase, if I may, different cells have different functions. And the Japanese example with the Nobel Prize in the discovery, I think, is very exciting. And of course, your Dr. Google is one I think that we all identify with. We all Dr. Google, and we can either interpret what we want to interpret from Dr. Google or not. But the warning is very appropriate. Let's go to Professor Euan Wallace, again, another Victorian, who is looking at curing CP. Are cells the answer? Euan Wallace.
Andrew, thank you. Good evening, everybody. So tonight what I want to do is just spend 5 minutes trying to answer, at least in part, this question, are cells the answer? And specifically, I would like to restrict my comments to cord blood cells or cord blood stem cells. I'm not going to use the word stem cells, but we'll talk about cord blood cells. And the use of cord blood cells in clinical trials around the world, and hopefully in Australia soon, are in the context of cerebral palsy, are in two applications. First, to prevent children developing cerebral palsy who are at high risk. And Iona has already shown us the sort of children who are at very high risk of developing cerebral palsy. So the child who's born very preterm, or the child who sustains a hypoxic insult during his or her labour or at the time of birth, for example. There are a large number of experimental studies, so studies undertaken in animal models, trying to mimic what happens to the human brain during development, that have shown that cord blood stem cells do in fact have a potential role. So there are experimental data that we don't have time to look at tonight that suggest very strongly that giving cord blood cells to babies at very high risk of developing cerebral palsy may actually prevent them developing it in the first place. And there are clinical trials asking that very question in human babies underway around the world currently. The second question, though, and the more challenging question, is if you give cord blood to children who already have cerebral palsy, then will you improve the brain injury and improve their functional outcome? There are no animal studies that have asked that question. So there are no studies that have taken animals who are 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years old with established brain injury and given those animals cord blood and asked whether the cord blood made a difference. So I want to introduce you to 4 people before sharing with you some clinical trial data that many of you have already seen or heard of. I want to introduce you to Dr. Hal Broxmeyer first. Now, so he's a PhD scientist and was one of the first scientists working in the US to suggest that cord blood, a resource that we throw out every day of the week, 300,000 times a year in Australia, may possess cells that could be used to transplant into individuals with leukemia or lymphoma or other blood cancers and malignancies. The second person I want to introduce is Matt Farrow. 25 years ago, Matt was a 5-year-old with a condition called Fanconi's anemia. It's a blood disorder, and 25 years ago, if you had Fanconi's anemia, you died. And you usually died before you were 10 years old. Now, Matt was very lucky because he was being cared for by a hematologist by the name of Joanne Kurtzberg, working at Duke in North Carolina. And Joanne had a colleague, one of her colleagues was Hal, who said, you know, there are cells in cord blood that potentially, at least in theory, at least in my laboratory, that if you gave to children like Matt, if you wiped out his bone marrow and gave him cord blood, then it might replace his bone marrow and cure him of his condition. And Joanne had a colleague, Eliane Gluckman, working in St. Louis, Paris, St. Louis Hospital in Paris. And they sent Matt from the States to Paris, and he underwent a cord blood transfusion. He's a healthy 30-year-old, he's married, and he has his own children. And if Hal and Joanne and their Parisian colleagues hadn't got together, then this man and his children would no longer exist. Now, why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because what happened back in the mid to late 80s so Matt was treated in 1988, the first cord blood recipient anywhere in the world. What was happening in cord blood and marrow transplant in 1988 feels a bit like cord blood and cerebral palsy today. So even in 2001, there was a Horizon Science program in the BBC in the United Kingdom that Joanne appeared in, recounting the tale of Matt and Hal and their Parisian colleagues. And she said, at that time, we think he had roughly a 10% chance of being cured of the disease. Put it another way, he had a 90% chance of failure. We had a 90% chance of failure. And yet they still did it. Today, over 30,000 people have received cord blood transplants for blood cancers or blood disorders of one sort or another. Individuals who are alive today who wouldn't be alive today had it not been for Hal and Joanne and, of course, Matt Farrow. So what's that got to do with cerebral palsy? Well, today we think, if we're lucky, that there'd be a 10% chance of cells working. But is that 10% worth taking? Well, we think it is. So here's a paper written by Joanne Kurtzberg about umbilical cord blood. And she wrote this paper only 7 years ago. 7 years ago. And she was writing about applications of umbilical cord blood beyond marrow transplant. And in this paper, 7 years ago, there is no mention of cerebral palsy whatsoever. So one of the world's leading researchers on cord blood and cerebral palsy doesn't even mention it 7 years ago. Now here's a figure looking at the number of children with cerebral palsy who have been treated at Duke with cord blood transplants. And you can see, or cord blood reinfusions, and you can see in 2006 there were 3 children. And then 2007, 6 or 7, and then more in 2008 and more in 2009. And the reason that there's a fall in the number of children being treated in 2010 is that 2010 saw the commencement of some formal randomized trials in Duke when children were being randomized to receive cord blood or not receive cord blood. And so clearly there are fewer children getting it. The point I'm making is that we have to take the leap of faith. We have to ask the question, could this work? Is it worth trying? And let's see what the results are. And earlier this year, the results of such a group's work were published in a journal called Stem Cells. And it was a group from South Korea. And I don't want to spend a lot of time looking at this study, but essentially what they did was they looked after about 90 children, and they offered them one of 3 treatments in a randomized manner. And in the first group of children, they offered cord blood, not the child's own cord blood, but donated cord blood, a drug called EPO, erythropoietin, that stimulates bone marrow, but is also thought to be a neuroprotectant. They gave cyclosporin, which is an immunosuppressant, and they gave that because they were giving the child someone else's blood, so they were trying to just immunosuppress them during the treatment. 31 children got such a treatment. The second group, the children just got EPO, so they didn't get any cord blood. And in the third group, the children got no therapy. All 3 groups got intensive rehabilitation therapy, so OT and physio. And at the point of entry to the study, at 1 month, at 3 months, and at 6 months, and the study ended at 6 months, the investigators assessed motor skills, so function, and neurodevelopmental, cognitive, mental outcomes. And they did some imaging. They did some MRI scans and PET scans, so scans of the brain and brain function, both at entry and at exit to the trial. And they looked at some side effects. Did the uses of cord blood cause any side effects to the children? The only important side effects were pneumonia. These are in children getting cord blood, were pneumonia and irritability. And we think that that was due to the cyclosporin, not the cord blood. What were the outcomes of the study? Well, the study showed that the function improved in children in all 3 groups. Remember, the children are getting older as the study's going on, and they're all getting intensive rehabilitation. So children in all 3 groups improved. But the biggest improvements were seen in the 31 children who received cord blood. At 1 month, there was evidence of improved cognitive mental function, and at 3 and 6 months, there was evidence of greater improvements in motor function. The scans, the MRI scans that they did, the brain scans, suggested that there may be improvements in white matter tracts, so the structure of the brain. There were some key things from the study, and that is that the younger children, and they defined those as children less than 3 years old or 3 years and older, the younger children showed the greatest improvements. So of all the children, remember there were only 31, of all of the children receiving cord blood, the best improvements appeared to be in children who were younger than 3. And also, the matching of the blood to the child, the closer that matching was, the better the improvements in motor and cognitive function. And those outcomes are important to us, to those of us who wish to plan a trial in Australia. So what does all this mean for Australia? Well, we would contest that further animal studies are not worthwhile. This one human clinical trial is proof of principle. Was it a perfect trial? It wasn't. Did it show dramatic changes that we would hope for? No, it didn't. But it showed improvements. And it showed sufficient improvements to merit mounting such a trial in Australia. And we think, with some urgency, because of the age effects, that we should progress to a national Australian trial of reinfusing cord blood into children with cerebral palsy. Now, there are allogeneic and autologous issues, so there will be children with cerebral palsy who have their own blood stored, and most would contest that that is the best blood to use. But the Koreans show us that even if you use blood donated by other families, that blood may well work. The animal studies, we think, should be reserved for exploring how the cells work. And we don't know, and no one knows. And as we spent earlier today in a scientific meeting discussing how such cells might work. And also animal studies have roles to play in understanding perhaps how other cells might work, and Megan's already discussed a whole plethora of other studies that may also have application. But there are about 100,000 cord blood donations sitting in banks in Australia that many of us think that we should begin to explore whether we can use in a properly controlled, properly designed trial for Australian children. Thank you.
Euan Wallace, and the subject of cord blood is fascinating, isn't it? And disturbing in many ways that all of that cord blood is being thrown out every year. And your example of the young guy, Matt Farrow, is a very interesting one, isn't it? It's a perfect example of 3 individuals in their field collaborating, having discussion, and then a good, positive, warm, fuzzy story comes out of it. And I think in many ways that's what we're here tonight doing, collaborating, sharing, and seeing how we're able to pursue in trying to find a cure and prevention for cerebral palsy. Now to Queensland. Stephen Archer is from Brisbane, and he's here with his 2 sons, soon to be 8 years old Zach. Makes us feel quite geriatric, Zach. And Stephen will talk to us about pursuing treatment for Zach. Would you please welcome Stephen Archer?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is probably really difficult to follow some fine speakers being very green to a stage. It's interesting for you guys to listen. But I'd also like to introduce my eldest son, Alex, as well. He's on my far right, as opposed to Zach, who's usually just far out there. I'd also like to begin... I'd also like to begin with an apology from my wife, their mum, Gabrielle, who couldn't be here tonight. She does send her kind regards and thoughts and does hope for a successful forum. We are honoured to be here tonight to take part. To see so many of you here and to know of the webcast highlights the importance of this forum. I applaud the CP Alliance for this discourse, and I think it's great that it is happening. For me, my background is in photography. That's unfortunate for my family, because they have indeed, in many enduring moments of being subjects to countless numbers of frames. And tonight we'd like to share some of these with you. There's the first. This one here is Zachary when he was 4 months of age. This was about the time just after he had the stroke. And that is how he became a child who obtained with cerebral palsy. So up until he was 4 months old, he was a perfectly healthy, wonderful young man. For us, fortunately, both our boys were born at the Marrow, Brisbane, Mum's Hospital. And what that meant for us was that we were invited to donate both of our boys' cord blood through the public blood banking system. And as it turned out, that was just obviously an unforeseen at the time, but an amazing thing that did transpire in the future. At the time that Zach had the stroke, he spent a week in hospital where there was diagnostics and going on all the time through that time. And the cause itself of the stroke remained, and still does remain, a mystery. As parents, we'd ask his doctors what it would mean for him in the long term. And this was something they had said to us that really that would be up to Zachary to determine. It would be up to Zachary how he would rise to any challenges caused by the damage of the stroke. As far as the medical condition goes, Zachary is right-sided hemiplegic, so he tends to have some serious issues with muscle spasticity in his particularly lower leg and upper right arm. Around the time, so in that time that Zachary's really been a lifelong candidate of therapies, of serial casting. That's pretty much been in since he was a time of about 4.5 months old. Just after he had the stroke, they started serial casting Zach. And that's continued on even through Botox program, which began at Zach when he was 2 years old. About the time he was 2, Zach started having some seizures, epilepsy. At the time when they first started, the seizures were really small. In fact, so small that really if you blinked you would miss it. They soon progressed, and they were somewhat aggressive in their development. At times, it was not uncommon for us really to see Zachary having about 100, 120 seizures a day. These were small seizures, lasting 2-3 seconds long. In that time, in the time since then, they have sort of clustered, if you will, I guess, for lack of a better term. And Zachy now has seizures on a bad day, 30 to 40 seizures a day. On a good day, 15. Those seizures now last about 10, 15 seconds long, as opposed to small seizures. In the 5 years that Zachy's had those seizures, anticonvulsants haven't seemed to have much of an impact on them. In Melbourne last year, we took Zachy down. In November last year, we took Zachy down to Melbourne, which provided some more closure. Up until that stage, Zachy was considered for epilepsy surgery, but in Melbourne that was discounted, as it was determined that Zachary's epilepsy would have happened regardless of the stroke or not. So what we were informed was that the epilepsy had nothing to do with the stroke, basically. Going back, pre-Duke, how we came about Duke, well, that came through, I guess, a colleague of Gabrielle's who had seen a segment on television of a doctor working with children with cerebral palsy with their own cord blood. We didn't know at the time who that was, so Dr. Munsie mentioned Google, Dr. Google. Well, we did. Excuse me. We Googled frantically, and we did end up finding Dr. Kurtzberg at Duke University. Within a short time, we'd made contact with Dr. Kurtzberg, And that then led us to asking more questions. Well, if it's done in the States, is it done here? So we sort of went up and down the eastern seaboard of Australia, talking to various institutions in Melbourne and Sydney, asking them whether we could get Zachary treated here, infused with his own cord blood. We've soon realised, though, we could not do that, so it was back to Duke. We then, before going back to Duke, we did go back to the cord blood bank in the public blood bank in Brisbane. We'd spoke to Dr. Rodwell, and we'd asked her whether it was still available, and if it was, whether we could actually access it to take it over to Duke. Well, we were told yes on both accounts. So the next question for us really was, well, what does this mean as far as side effects? Are there any side effects? And I guess when it comes to novel therapies, I guess there's perhaps no such thing as stupid questions. We asked all sorts of doctors, haematologists and biochemists, and his doctors in the hospital, his neurologists, whether there would be any detriment to Zachary receiving his own cord blood. And everyone we had spoken to said no. People had spoken to us about use of cord blood in therapies that had been around for a long time. But no one had actually said to us that what you could do could be damaging him. So with that, with I guess the no harm principle, we decided to then apply to Duke. Zach's medical records were sent to Duke. Zach was considered by Dr. Kurtzberg, and his criteria, well, he fitted the criteria of Dr. Kurtzberg's work. I must say this, we didn't go to Duke to be treated under the clinical trial that Professor Wallace mentioned before. We approached Dr. Kurtzberg and asked whether Zachary could be treated in a one-off instance. If I can just briefly explain, I'm not a scientist person, but from my understanding, a blind randomised trial would require two treatments, if you will, one with a placebo and one with the cord blood. That would mean for us taking 2 trips to the States, roughly 12 months apart. And we didn't, as I say, apply to qualify under the clinical trial, which would have in turn, I should say this as well, would not have incurred any medical costs to us. As we didn't go through a medical trial, with all costs, including travel, I must say there was little change from $40,000. Sorry, just lost my place here, won't be a second. I should say, to assist this too, our goal was achieved with overwhelming community spirit through some fundraising we had put on. Zach's school was very supportive in seeing him get to America, as was our local community and some businesses. The procedure at Duke was really was a 2-day procedure. The first day was really a checking of health and Zach's history. And the second day we met up with Dr. Kurtzberg, and that was for the first time we met her. Dr. Kurtzberg had reminded us of the side effects that are related to the procedure, and I should say, in Zach's case, they seem to be fairly limited side effects. Again, I'm not a scientific person, but from what I understood, the major side effects would be related to the product known as DMSO, which is, I believe, a product used with the cord blood to prevent ice crystals from forming. As far as I'm aware, as much of that product is removed and the cells are rinsed before Zach was infused with his cord blood. The procedure itself really it was a fairly simple, quick procedure. Zach was given a slight sedative. before the procedure. An IV saline drip on cannula was placed into his arm, into his wrist, I should say. Dr. Kurtzberg entered the room, had a small bag filled with cord blood, and attached that to the end of the IV drip, and within about 15, 20 minutes, the whole procedure was over. Forgot about these slides. I'll just move on quickly through these slides, because I just wanted to... This is sort of Duke, and in the bottom right corner is, as you saw with Professor Wallace, is a photograph of Dr. Kurtzberg. And this was how Zach was within about, as I say, 15, 20 minutes after the procedure. I must say, in the bottom photograph there, the remnants of an ice cream that was ingested within, as I say, about half an hour or so after the procedure, and that was after a small anaesthetic. And can I just say, the Americans really know how to make king-size ice creams, because it was. So the procedure then from there followed with really some rest for the next couple of hours. Zach was released from hospital that evening. The next day it was just merely a quick follow-up, go in, say hello, make sure that he was still breathing, he was fine, and we were pretty much free to travel back home after that. Now, perhaps some news that not everyone would like to hear, I guess. This procedure for us happened in November 2010. Now, it's a little while ago now. I would really like to stand here before you tonight and say that we had seen significant progress in Zach since that time. I really do wish I could say that. I can't. That doesn't mean it's a failure. I don't believe it's a failure. And I think there's a lot of parents here tonight who've perhaps got these questions. I feel, purely as a parent, that yes, we had to try. It came back to a situation of it was a no-harm scenario. That had to underpin everything. That we were not putting Zachary into a position whereby we were going to make him worse than what he had already gone through. If that had happened, how could I live with myself? I don't know. Thankfully it didn't, and we were fairly sure that it wasn't going to be that way. We had what we believed was the best sound advice. My only suggestion is, yes, the Dr. Google does leave one's mind going astray at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I think the thing you have to do is to come back and put things into perspective. I think you really need to talk to as many people as you can. Create a dialogue. Talk to your doctors, other doctors. And even when those doctors laugh, some doctors may sort of tend to laugh at you, move on and then talk to other doctors. I just wanted to sum up tonight by saying that when we found out that this procedure at Duke existed, I as a parent was no longer ignorant that something was out there. Something had existed. I felt, and it's perhaps a little bit of a harsh critique on myself, but I felt that if I didn't follow it, then maybe I was guilty of neglect. So there was times, it was 16 months to get to Duke. From the time we found out that Duke existed to us getting there was 16 months. It was a lot of time to reflect, to think about it, to scream at the gods of cord blood. We did it. I'm thankful we did it. Would I do it again, knowing it was a no-harm situation? I would. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me.
Stephen Archer from Brisbane, and a very powerful story from a parent's perspective. And of course, as parents, we always have that responsibility of wanting the best for our child under any circumstances, whether that applies to ice cream or not. And Zach, I'm glad you enjoyed the ice cream. It's also interesting, isn't it, when you have in the family a photographer who is able to put all of this into a context and portray it over a period of years. And it's also challenging and humbling being a parent, Stephen. If you remember, prior to us commencing tonight, your boy said something to the effect, well, Dad's looking forward to tonight. He's looking forward to his 9 minutes of fame. So Alex and Zach, I'm glad Stephen's had his 9 minutes of fame. Thank you to all of our speakers tonight for a very comprehensive overview of what is a very exciting field. And now I think it's your turn to ask questions. And don't forget, those who are streaming, you can also apply your questions, as we said earlier, using the hashtag. But we'd love to hear from you as well. And if not, you can then see this again, as we've mentioned on the website. So let's open up for questions to any of our speakers. They're all brave, they're all bold, and they are all keen to give you further words of wisdom, if you would. Just while we're getting started, I thought it would be quite interesting either to hear some views either from Megan or Iona or from Euan in terms of, as Stephen talked about, should I store cord blood? Is that appropriate? Everyone's looking and nodding, but we need an academic to take the initiative.
It's a vexed question, Andrew. I think the challenge is that, well, Stephen's already said, that each of us want to do the best by our children. And the thought of not storing blood and then in 5 years' time finding that it actually works, at least for some children, it'd be difficult to know how one would feel about that. So I often get asked by prospective parents, should I store blood for this child I'm pregnant with? I've got an existing child with cerebral palsy or diabetes or something else. And inevitably there's this tension of it's really blackmail, that you're wanting to do the best by your child, but also not really knowing. I think the honest answer is we don't honestly know. It's an if it works, then it's an insurance policy. If it doesn't work, then it's been a waste of time. But if you don't do it, then I think the data that do exist suggests that the closest to the match, the better, and of course the best match is the child's own blood.
Megan, from your point of view.
I'd also add, I completely agree, it's a difficult choice, but I also think we've got to respect the public bank. I mean, if we can, donate it to the public bank. If you're having any capacity. It was my great regret I couldn't donate my children's cord blood because the hospital I went to didn't have that capacity. But if you can, do that rather than throw it out, because we know that blood is being used now.
Iona, I still have visions of you with your pinkish elephant. How long will the pink elephant remain in the room, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we are making enormous strides, and that graph about how much work has been done in cerebral palsy is maybe the most important one. I expect that we're going to continue to find more treatments, and we're learning more all the time. So it is important, however, that we do balance that it is very reasonable for people with cerebral palsy and their families to want even larger gains from treatment than we currently offer. And I believe that we now have an ethical responsibility based on this data that Euan talked about to test this model in Australia, and I think that's the most ethical way forward. Yes, we have to absolutely balance doing no harm but we also have to balance striving and pushing forward. And things only happen in medicine and science when people actually dare to believe that something else is possible. And I believe that's an important stake in the ground that we must take in Australia for people with cerebral palsy.
So it's a bit like the man on the moon, is it? The fact that we always thought we might get to the moon, but when the man actually got to the moon, we couldn't quite believe it.
Well, you know, some people still find the man landing on the moon a sense of wonderment, and I want to believe in a world that research can bring things to people with cerebral palsy that has a sense of wonderment. I want to be in that space.
I'm sure we all do, but you're not actually doubting that Neil Armstrong did not go to the moon. Otherwise, there'll be one of Megan's headlines, I can see. Not in the Sydney Morning Herald, but in The Age, particularly in Melbourne. So any questions from your point of view? Please. We'll just get you a mic.
Thank you. My name's Maria, and I'm mum to a 14-month-old little boy who's recently been diagnosed with CP. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for holding this forum. My husband and I have been heavily researching stem cells as a form of therapy for our son, and we're convinced that it will help in some way. I'm not saying it's a cure at this point, but any sort of improvement would be something for us. I guess I'm very excited to hear as well that, you know, Australia is interested in having these trials, and as a parent I'd like to know what I could do to help make that happen. Like, who can I lobby? What can we do? You know, really encouraged here to do something about it to help my son and to help all these other kids and people who have CP. And also dealing with this issue about storing cord blood. I didn't make that decision, something that I do regret, but even having not done that, my child was born as a result of a placental abruption. He suffered lack of oxygen at that time, and I've understood that there was very little to no blood left in the cord when he was born anyway. So I guess as a plea, my hope would be that we do run allogenic trials as well, not just like the ones at Duke University, which they use their own their own cord blood. And also I've read in my research that umbilical cord blood cells have very low risk of rejection in terms of risk going forward because they're less mature than other stem cells. So I was just hoping you could give me some feedback on that as well. Thank you.
Well, where do we start?
I'm not sure I can answer your lobbying question. I mean, I think events like this are really important. The fact that we can talk about it openly, and we live in a country where we can have a very open and honest debate, which is fantastic. We also live in a country that have an enormously rich resource of public banked cord blood that, if we can get the right people talking together, potentially are accessible for children like your wee boy who you don't have cord blood stored for. In terms of the risks then of giving blood that don't belong to the individual, so unlike Zach, who individual children with cerebral palsy don't have their own blood stored, I think you're right. I mean, remember that this story of cord blood use came back from the late 80s when we were using it for transplant. And much of the discussions about the use of cord blood are still in the context of transplant, where we're asking the cells to replace the bone marrow in the patient receiving it. In the context of cerebral palsy, actually we're not asking the cells to do that. And we think now that the cells are working through mechanisms very different from actually turning into brain cells. We think that they're assisting the brain repair itself. And the most recent data, experimental studies suggest that actually all they're doing is they're triggering the brain to do all the reparation itself. You're absolutely right. I think the risks of rejection or some harm caused by infusing these cells into individuals they don't belong to is extremely small. And you only have to go back a couple of decades when blood transfusions were whole blood transfusions, that we gave the cells, similar cells, as part of a routine blood transfusion. Now, that's quite different to the blood transfusions from today, but that's how they were 20 years ago. But again, one of the great things about Australia is we have the transfusion physician experts here that can answer all those questions for us. So we have the cerebral palsy experts, we have the transfusion experts, we have the stem cell biologists, we have the neurologists and the pediatricians. If Australia can't do it, no one can do it.
And indeed, we are leading the world internationally, which, is very surprising. And I think it's fabulous that we are. And in terms of lobbying, it's been a very good example, I think, in recent weeks when you look at the National Disability Insurance Scheme or disability care to see the power of people pulling together with a common purpose. And who would have thought that that would ever have eventuated?
Yeah, so I'd like to add to that. If you're a parent or a person with cerebral palsy that would be interested in participating in that long-term conversation, this needs to be a strong partnership between good science, like what Euan's talking about, and from people saying this is what Australians want. And we know that things can get done. Australia is an incredibly research productive country, but actually to get things done you actually have to have the marriage of science and people saying this is what we want as patients. So if you'd like to be involved in that debate, we would like to partner with you to see if we could make this trial a reality.
And of course 20 years ago the concept of asking somebody with cerebral palsy or with any form of disability, what do you want and would you like to be involved, was not there. So we're indulged. Let's utilise and exploit the opportunity. Question, please. Mike's coming towards you.
Hi, a question with regards to stem cell infusion when, if it is to happen, how much, say for example a cord blood, or if you had the luxury of your own cord blood, would actually be used? Is it all used up in one transfusion, or is there opportunities as we learn better ways how to administer, where to administer, rather than just a blood transfusion, whether to site? Is it all used up in one, or do you extract certain cells that still can remain available for future treatments as it evolves?
What a great question. The challenge is that we don't actually, so as Megan showed you, there are lots of different types of cells, and even within cord blood there are dozen different types of cells that may have these reparative effects. And if we were honest, we don't know which of those cells are the ones that are working if they work, if there's more than one cell type that's required or if there's only one cell type. So at the moment, the answer to your question is that in most of the trials, depending on the volume of blood collected in the first place, it's the whole collection that's reinfused. But there will be some children who have enough blood collected that they may only use part of that collection for reinfusion. I don't know, Stephen, did you use all of Zach's collection, or is there still one?
No, some of Zach's cord blood is still stored in North Carolina, the residue of the infusion. So
it depends on how much the original collection is. But probably the majority of children in Australia who would get a cord blood reinfusion would not be getting their own blood. Would be getting a donated blood unit.
If you're receiving a donor cord transplant, are there issues then with rejection? You're talking about the drugs to actually suppress the immunisation. If you are having, down the track, when we know this is a procedure that it's wonderful, it works, if you're receiving from multiple donors, would that then open another issue of concern?
Again, a great question. We don't think so. So we think in the first instance it would be a single donor reinfusion. And we think that how these cells work is actually they quieten down the immune system. So they quieten down the anger that's going on in the injured brain, and which is why we think that they are not likely to cause rejection or immune problems. But those are the sort of questions that the scientists are asking as the trials are being designed. Because as Stephen said, the purpose of doing the trial, or the reason that the trial is needed, is we don't know. If we knew, we would either be doing it or not doing it already. And so when you do a trial, one of the key things that underpins a good trial is first do no harm. So the design of the trials is such that they're minimizing risks of harm to individual children.
And can I just add, if I may, before this goes off, from a streaming point of view, there is a question. how can we volunteer for a possible trial? Our child has just turned 2, and we would love it if she could have such an opportunity.
We'd be happy at Cerebral Palsy Alliance to take names of people that would be interested in contacted again, and then of course we would use a standard research-based process of informing you about the potential benefits, the potential risks, what the involvement and the option to pull out, and so that then it went through a proper ethics procedure. But we'd be happy to keep names here of people that are interested.
We have the name and we have the email address. We haven't got the Visa card number though. Sarah.
I just had a question in regard to the immune response of using a related cord blood. So with the immune response that would be likely to be in the cord blood, I'm wondering whether it would be more related to the mother's immune system, and whether that would mean if you had a sibling who was having a baby and was able to store the cord blood and you hadn't previously stored it, would that be a better and less likely to react with a baby who was related, who had cerebral palsy, if you were going to use the cord blood?
Yes, so I guess what the Korean trial suggests is that if the child didn't have their own blood stored down, then the next best thing would be the closest, what they call HLA match, which is just a tissue typing match. So the closest match possible. And that's often in a sibling, so a brother or sister, for whom there's cord blood stored down. So that would certainly be worth exploring. Again, one of the values of the 100,000 or so stored donations in our banks is that there's this greater possibility for very tight HLA matching for unrelated donors.
Sir.
Hi, I'm Julius. I think I got 2 parts to my question. First, would this help adults with cerebral palsy? The reason why I'm asking, my wife that's sitting next to me, her walking has declined over the last 6-7 months, and my wife has actually baffled doctors. They can't work out why. And I was just wondering if this might help her.
It's a very interesting question, isn't it? I mean, would in fact this help an adult with cerebral palsy? And when you talked about your wife baffling doctors, I think it's fair to say that most women baffle doctors, except those who are here. Response?
The honest answer is we don't know. No one has asked, and so there is no answer. And I think, again, I think the route to answering that question is first to ask the question in children and then extrapolate from there. So I think we're a very long way away from answering your question. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about, Megan, sort of touched upon, is that we've got to discussing this tonight because of the diverse potential application of stem cells. So they've been proposed as treatments for multiple sclerosis, for Parkinson's disease, for heart disease, for liver cirrhosis, for bone diseases, and so on and so forth. And there are hundreds of clinical trials going on around the world addressing almost every condition you can think of. I just wish they'd hurry up and finish the trials and give us the answers. So we can't answer your question. I'm so sorry.
We have another question on the streaming process. We've had 3 lots of stem cell therapy, 1 in Germany, 2 in China. First time with our son, stem cells extracted from him in Germany, the other 2 in China from donated cord blood. We've now heard talk of stem cell use in Korea. Is there any information on which types of stem cells are more beneficial? And as we have heard, that donated cord blood stem cells just get destroyed by the child's immune system. Any information would be great. Thanks.
Well, again, I think the answer is we just don't know yet. And I wanted to raise another issue that would sort of follow on from the question around clinical trials. I think it's really good to start thinking about what it is that is being offered, what type of cell it is, because I think it goes to the heart of Stephen's comment around risk and do no harm. We know that some stem cells have a different growth potential than others, so the risk associated with using cord blood is much lower than the risk, for example, using cells derived from embryos. Okay, so there's kind of like, and the reason for that is that cells derived from embryos have a greater capacity to grow, a greater capacity to form a tumour, and you don't want a tumour. The second thing I wanted to raise was when you are thinking about stem cell treatments and you want to ask some questions, not only is the risk associated with the stem cells, it's with how the stem cell is being used and delivered back to the patient. So we've been talking about intravenous infusion tonight. There are clinics that will inject the cells directly into the child's brain. There have been people who've died following, children and also adults, who've died following those procedures. Is the risk worth it? So the intervention itself can be, in the child, in the case I'm thinking of, that the child and the other people who've died have not died of stem cells forming tumours. They've died because of the risk associated with a very, very invasive technique. And I would argue that risk-benefit analysis wouldn't support doing that. So it's just something else to consider.
Before we say goodnight, and I'm aware of the time from your point of view, last question from Sarah.
Thanks. It's just a comment. I'm a research fellow here and I run the New South Wales CP Register. So a really easy way that people could stay in contact about this is by putting themselves on the register and their children on the CP Register, and we will always let people know about research that's happening through the register. So it's one way that people can be assured that they'll know about stem cell research. Just another comment about the fact that your family have said tonight that you didn't see any real benefits with the procedure, and we haven't talked about that in the discussion. And in the latest clinical trial where they actually didn't have a stem cell only group. So they had stem cells with EPO on their own, and just a control group, and they all had intervention. So it's just an interesting insight. I mean, I don't know why they didn't choose to have a group of only stem cells, but there's something to me that's saying stem cells plus other things might show a bit more promise as well.
Can I just say on that, in response to that, we certainly look forward to where this goes from here, because as I've just mentioned before, there is still some cord blood in residue over in the States. So if this is to get going again, then yes, we are certainly not discontinued with any of this. We are certainly well supportive of this, to see this happen, to see this come to fruition. To give a, it may not have worked for Zach, but that certainly doesn't mean it may not or has not worked for other children. And that's why we're here really, is to support the foundations of what these guys are doing, and and to push this through as best as we can. Not just for Zach, but we were supported to get to the States, and we'd like to give something a little bit back if we can.
And in terms of each of us giving a little back, I think it's probably summed up in many ways from Iona's earlier comment, which dialogue is important, and what the academics and the foundation are looking for is your input and what you want. So it's a dual marriage in a sense, and that's important for that marriage to work. Like any partnerships, like any marriage. So look, let's conclude tonight's discussion. We could obviously go on until midnight, and I'm happy to do that, but probably you might be looking forward to going home and having some dinner. We trust that you found it interesting and informative tonight. If you have any questions at all relating to tonight's forum or anything else that you haven't had a chance to cover, please email us. The email address is contact@cerebralpalsy.org.au. And would you please thank me in thanking our panellists tonight, Iona Novak, Megan Munsie, Euan Wallace, Stephen Archer, and Alex and Zach Archer. Thank you very much indeed for coming. And if you've participated on stream, live on stream, we're very grateful around the world, including Rob White, our CEO in Hong Kong, and 3-day-old grandson in Dabo Hospital, another part of the globe. And we look forward to this continuing discussion, and it's quite an exciting field in terms of what we are living with and seeing the changes in cerebral palsy and disability in a very general sense. So from Cerebral Palsy Alliance headquarters here at Allambie Heights in Sydney, Australia, good night.